the year 1303, in a castle dungeon somewhere in medieval Europe, a man's screams echoed through stone corridors as executioners began their gruesome work. They started at his ankles, carefully peeling back his skin like unwrapping a gift. Except this gift was death itself, delivered with surgical precision over the course of hours. The victim, still breathing, still conscious, still feeling every excruciating moment as his own flesh was systematically removed from his living body. This wasn't torture. This was justice. Medieval justice. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about medieval punishment. Because flaying alive, the practice of skinning criminals while they were still breathing, wasn't just some barbaric anomaly carried out by sadistic individuals. It was a calculated, methodical form of execution that served multiple purposes in medieval society, and the psychological reasoning behind it will shock you. Picture this. You're living in 13th century Europe. There's no police force as we know it, no prison system, no rehabilitation programs. Justice isn't about reform, it's about deterrence, spectacle, and sending a message so powerful that it would echo through generations. And few messages were as clear as the sight of human skin hanging from castle walls like a grotesque banner. But here's what most people don't realize. Nice flaying alive wasn't random violence. It was reserved for the worst of the worst, traitors who betrayed their lords, corrupt judges who sold justice to the highest bidder, religious heretics who threatened the very fabric of society. These weren't petty criminals. These were individuals whose crimes were so heinous that ordinary execution simply wasn't enough. Let me take you back to one of the most documented cases in medieval history. The year is 1040, and we're in the Byzantine Empire. A high-ranking official named Basil Boioannes has been caught embezzling massive amounts from the imperial treasury, money meant to defend the empire against Muslim invasions. Emperor Michael IV doesn't just want him dead. He wants to make an example that will terrify every future official who might consider betraying the empire. The sentence is pronounced death by flaying. But this isn't a quick execution. The imperial executioners are artists of agony, trained in the precise technique that would keep Boioannes conscious for as long as possible. They begin with small incisions at the extremities, fingers and toes, working their way inward. The skin comes off in carefully planned strips, each cut calculated to avoid major blood vessels that would cause rapid blood loss and merciful unconsciousness. The crowd watches in horrified fascination as hours pass. Boioannes' screams gradually weaken, but his eyes remain open, aware, trapped in a body that's being methodically destroyed. The executioners work with the precision of surgeons, occasionally pausing to allow the victim to remain conscious, sometimes even offering water to prevent dehydration-induced fainting. But here's the truly disturbing part. This wasn't considered cruel by medieval standards. This was justice served according to the principle of proportional punishment. The theory was simple. The more heinous your crime against society, the more heinous your punishment should be. Boioannes had betrayed an entire empire, potentially causing the deaths of thousands of soldiers who couldn't be equipped because of his theft. In medieval logic, his suffering should match the suffering he caused. Now, you might be wondering, how exactly did they keep someone alive during this process? The medieval executioners had developed techniques that would make modern torture specialists uncomfortable. They understood human anatomy in ways that allowed them to prolong life while maximizing pain. First, they would start with areas of the body that had fewer major blood vessels: hands, feet, face. The facial skin was often removed first because it was psychologically devastating for both the victim and the witnesses. Imagine watching someone's face literally peeled away while they're still speaking, still pleading, still very much alive. The executioners knew exactly where to cut, to avoid the carotid arteries, the major vessels in the arms and legs, the femoral arteries. They would work systematically, like a butcher who knows every inch of his craft. Except their goal wasn't efficient slaughter, it was prolonged consciousness. But flaying alive served purposes beyond just punishment. It was psychological warfare. In an age where most people couldn't read, public executions were the primary means of mass communication. The sight of a flayed criminal wasn't just about punishing one individual, it was about programming an entire population. Consider the case of Marsyas in ancient times, whose story was retold throughout the medieval period. According to legend, Marsyas challenged Apollo to a musical contest and lost. His punishment? Flaying alive. But medieval chroniclers didn't just tell this story for entertainment. They used it as a template, a justification for their own practices. If the gods themselves used flaying as punishment, how could mortals question its morality? The psychological impact on witnesses was carefully calculated. Medieval authorities understood that the most effective deterrent wasn't just death, it was the fear of a specific type of death. When a potential criminal saw the flayed skin of a traitor hanging from the city gates, the message was crystal clear: this could be you. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Sometimes, the flayed skin was preserved and displayed for years. In some cases, it was made into leather and used to bind books, often books of law or religious texts. Imagine opening a legal document and knowing that the binding was made from the skin of someone who broke that very law. The town of Bury St Edmunds in England still has a door supposedly bound with the skin of a flayed criminal from the medieval period. Whether it's authentic or not, the fact that people believed it and preserved it tells us everything we need to know about the cultural impact of this practice. Now let's talk about the most famous case of judicial flaying in medieval history. The case of Sisamnes, a corrupt Persian judge whose story became a cautionary tale throughout medieval Europe. According to the historian Herodotus, Sisamnes had accepted bribes and perverted justice. King Cambyses ordered him flayed alive. And here's the truly macabre part: he had Sisamnes' skin made into strips that were used to upholster the judge's chair. Then, he appointed Sisamnes' own son as the new judge, forcing him to sit on a chair upholstered with his father's skin every time he made a legal decision. Think about the psychological impact of that. Every day sitting on your father's skin, making decisions about justice and law. The message couldn't be clearer. Corruption will not just cost you your life, it will cost you your humanity, your dignity, and even your death will serve as a tool to ensure justice. This story was so powerful that it was painted by Gerard David in 1498, and copies of this painting hung in courthouses across Europe for centuries. Judges would make their decisions literally looking at a depiction of what happened to corrupt judges. But flaying alive wasn't just about corruption or treason. It was also used against religious heretics, and here the symbolism became even more complex. In medieval Christian theology, the body was a temple of the soul. Flaying alive was seen as a form of purification, literally removing the corrupted flesh to free the soul for judgment. It was simultaneously punishment, and in their twisted logic, salvation. The records from the Spanish Inquisition show us cases where heretics were flayed alive while priests prayed for their souls, believing that the extreme physical suffering would burn away spiritual corruption. The victims' screams were interpreted as the cries of demons being expelled from the body. But here's what's truly chilling. Many of these victims, according to contemporary accounts, eventually stopped screaming, not because they died, but because they entered a state of shock so profound that they became almost catatonic. Medieval chroniclers interpreted this as spiritual transcendence, as evidence that the punishment was working and the soul was being purified. Modern medicine tells us this was likely dissociative shock, the mind's last desperate attempt to escape unbearable trauma. But to medieval observers, it was proof of divine intervention. Now, you might be thinking that flaying alive was exclusively a European practice, but you'd be wrong. Similar practices existed across cultures and continents, suggesting something deeply disturbing about human nature itself. In ancient Assyria, flaying alive was used against conquered enemies, particularly leaders of rebellious cities. The Assyrians would flay enemy kings alive in front of their own people, then display the skins as banners during victory parades. This wasn't just execution, it was psychological conquest, breaking the spirit of entire civilizations. The Aztecs had their own version, associated with the god Zipe Totec, our lord the flayed one. During certain religious festivals, prisoners would be flayed alive, and their skins worn by priests in ritual dances. The symbolism was agricultural now. The removal of old skin represented the earth, shedding its winter covering to reveal new growth. But perhaps the most systematic use of flaying alive occurred in medieval China, where it was known as lengqi, or death by 1,000 cuts. This wasn't random violence. It was a precise legal punishment with detailed procedural manuals explaining exactly how to keep the victim alive for maximum duration. Chinese executioners were trained for years in the proper technique. They had charts showing the order in which cuts should be made, the depth of each incision, the timing between cuts. Some victims reportedly survived for days, conscious throughout most of the ordeal. What's fascinating is how these practices evolved differently across cultures, yet maintained similar core principles: prolonged consciousness, maximum psychological impact, and symbolic meaning beyond simple punishment. But here's the question that haunts historians. Did flaying alive actually work as a deterrent? The evidence is mixed and troubling. On one hand, crime rates in areas where flaying was practiced don't show significant decreases compared to areas using other forms of execution. People still committed treason, still accepted bribes, still challenged religious authority. The human capacity for rationalization apparently extended even to the fear of being skinned alive. On the other hand, the psychological impact on entire populations was undeniable. Medieval chroniclers report that the mere threat of flaying was sometimes enough to end rebellions, extract confessions, or maintain social order. The practice created a culture of fear that extended far beyond the actual victims. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of flaying alive wasn't the physical torture itself, but what it reveals about the human capacity for rationalization. Every culture that practiced it developed elaborate justifications: religious purification, proportional justice, social deterrence, divine mandate. Medieval legal scholars wrote extensive treatises explaining why flaying alive was not only permissible but necessary for a just society. They cited biblical precedents, classical authorities, natural law theories. They convinced themselves and their societies that skinning people alive was not barbarism but civilization. The practice of flaying alive began to decline in Europe during the late medieval period, not because of moral objections but because of practical considerations. It was expensive, time-consuming, and required skilled executioners. More importantly, it was so shocking that it sometimes provoked riots or revenge attacks against authorities. By the Renaissance, most European legal systems had moved toward more humane forms of execution: hanging, beheading, or burning. Flaying alive became increasingly rare, relegated to only the most extreme cases of treason or heresy. The last recorded judicial flaying in Europe occurred in the 17th century, though informal cases may have continued much later in some regions. The practice persisted longer in other parts of the world, with some reports of ritual flaying continuing into the 19th century. Today, flaying alive exists primarily in historical records and the occasional horror movie, but its legacy lingers in ways we don't often consider. The phrase "skin alive" remains in our language as a threat of severe punishment. The image of flayed skin continues to fascinate and horrify us in art, literature, and popular culture. More importantly, the historical reality of flaying alive forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature, justice, and the thin veneer of civilization. How did entire societies convince themselves that skinning people alive was not only acceptable but necessary? What does this tell us about our own capacity for moral blindness? And perhaps most disturbing of all, in our modern world of enhanced interrogation techniques, psychological torture, and state-sanctioned violence, are we really so different from our medieval ancestors? Or have we simply become more sophisticated in our cruelty, more subtle in our barbarity? The screams have faded from the castle dungeons, but the questions they raise about human nature remain as sharp as the executioner's blade. What do you think? Could you have been part of a society that normalized such extreme punishment? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. But be warned, this topic tends to reveal things about human nature that many people prefer not to discuss. If this historical deep dive into humanity's darkest practices fascinated you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Next week we're exploring another medieval practice that will make flaying alive seem almost merciful by comparison. And if you made it this far, you're clearly someone who isn't afraid to confront the darker chapters of human history. Share this video with someone who can handle the truth about what our ancestors were capable of. Until next time, remember, understanding our past isn't about judgment. It's about ensuring we never repeat it.